the centering of equality in public policy and also at the heart of good public administration can't be a party political wrangle. I mean, we can argue the toss from a party political point of view, and I mean, all of us are familiar with the Irish political system, and you'll know in your own minds those parties that are better disposed, let's say, to talking about equality and advancing equality rather than others. I mean, that's a political fact of life. But I think we actually need to get to a point where we understand that equality budgeting, equality proofing, equality delivery, crucially, is not something that is the possession of one ideological position or one political party. It makes common sense, and it has to be a matter of good practice in public administration. So in other words, if we pride ourselves as a democratic system, if we say that we are a decent and worthwhile society, if we say that we are governed by the rule of law, respect for human rights, and so on and so forth, let's see it then. Because the proof of that pudding is whether or not your public administration, your public policy system and deliverance actually honours and recognises that. So for me, if I were to put it in kind of a nutshell, that's the challenge for us, and it's a very, very considerable challenge. And I'd agree pretty much with everything that Stephen said, except that I found my way to the right gate on the first day of the Dáil. But it's also my first term in the Dáil. I was previously a member of the European Parliament for 5 years, very different sort of political dynamic there. But even for me, and I'm not that new to politics, it was a very strange moment to go into the Dáil chamber and to take my seat as a woman with the full chamber, because it was only at that precise moment that I really got the maleness of the institution. And because it's quite a small chamber, you know, you could be having a right go with a colleague across the floor, and if you had long arms you could reach out and touch them. We've a real problem in Irish political culture. I am not saying for a moment that gender is the only issue, but it is my view that it is the most substantial issue. I think it's not a matter of detail or how the chamber looks. It is a real political problem for us, because it influences every decision that's taken in that place. It influences the tenor of the debate, the content of the debate. And believe it or not, and I'm sure you'll have no difficulty believing it, very often you could sit through an entire debate on a very important matter and you will not hear one female voice. Yeah. Now that's not just a matter of style, that's a real problem for us, and we need to say that out loud. And I know that there's many people here who do, but I think as activists and as citizens we need to be clear that we can't let the political system off with the business of mentioning us on International Women's Day. That drives me nuts. Yeah, thank you for acknowledging. And as a woman active in politics and elected to the Dáil, I want to say to you that I want to see the day where you're not the exception, where you're not asked how do you do it, or for men usually the reaction to me is, Jay, you're an awful woman, you know, really. You want to be, this needs to be mainstream, but women in particular, and along with men, but we need to make that demand. We need to be very clear in our head that we're going to make it happen and that we're demanding that it does happen. So there's that gender issue in the political culture, but there's something else, and Stephen has put it very well, and it is that lack of what he has called, and I'll borrow his term, an evidence-based approach. So that leads you to the very real dilemma that you're very often, whether in government or opposition, perhaps shooting in the dark as regards the actual impact on whatever dimension of decisions that you're taking, budgetary decisions that you're taking, but also does something else. It leaves a vacuum into which prejudice and stereotype and sometimes very negative propaganda can step in. And let me instance the case of lone parent families. Because for as long as I remember, when I came to a level of maturity to understand what was going on in the world around me, I know that families headed by a single parent have been scapegoated. And it's been done routinely, it's been done very brazenly, and if we're honest about it, it's done without a huge public reaction to it, because somewhere in the back of the public mind there's a sense that this crowd are on the take. And somehow they're kind of freeloading on the rest of us, and it's not quite kosher. When you go then you actually look at the evidence in terms of the income levels and the standard of living, and then the cutbacks, of course, endured by families headed by single parents, you see that the reality is completely different. The stereotype and the demonisation couldn't be more wrong. And for me, the issue of evidence and data is important to make the right decisions, but it's also important to get the right information out to the general public, because I don't believe that we should tolerate any group in society being blackened in that way and being targeted in that way. I just think it's wrong. And if the general public had access to the correct information, I can tell you this much, they would take a very, very different view in respect of that category of people. So we need to get equality front and centre as part of the public policy process, but also as part of the public discourse. And I just want to say a few words about political leverage and how we might make that happen. Stephen has already told you that we've had an initial conversation around making a cross-party, non-party, cross-political pitch to government in respect of equality budgeting. So we're going to work on that. I think that the activism of civic organisations and citizens in tandem with that move would be extremely helpful and extremely useful. So just maybe to say that to you. But there's a couple of other things that I want to identify also. I know that you had Patricia here earlier. I know the information on Scotland is really, really interesting, really valuable for us here. But Patricia, I'm sure, talked about Section 75 of the 1998 legislation. So let me just say it. Let me up and say it to you. That's just up the road. It's not in Outer Timor. It's in this country. It's part and parcel of what was agreed around Good Friday. And as you know, they're going into the ins and outs of all of the detail of that agreement. It was posited very much on an all-Ireland basis. And I actually think that we can